Hello and welcome to the Spiritual Sexual Shamanic Podcast. I'm Simon Marvell, and it's my pleasure to be talking with today Jamie Ziegelbaum. Jamie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to talk with you. We've been messaging about doing this episode for a minute now, and messaging about other things which I've been really interested in also, and maybe we can reveal some of that today. But perhaps you could get us started by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I work in decentralized governance, and that's mostly what we'll be talking about. I came to that through a winding path. I started studying neuroscience, and then dropped out and was drug addict, and got sober, and went back to school and got really deep into technology, human computer interaction, which is really kind of combo of design, psychology, and computer science. And I was inventing new types of computer interfaces, and I really wanted to change the way that we relate to computing, make it more physical, have computers learn our language rather than us having to learn these abstractions. I did that in research for a while, and then I went actually and used all those materials to become an artist. And I made interactive digital art using the kind of same processes you'd use to make a phone, but to make sculpture, like sensors and lights and robotics and things. All with the question of really like, what is communication? Trying to understand what it means to communicate with each other. And from there, I did a number of different things. I was an entrepreneur. I started different companies. But then I kind of fell deep into the gravity well of crypto in 2020 when DeFi summer happened, which is a period where all of a sudden blockchain technology was able to support really interesting services, and mostly kind of gambling related, but like, money, financial instruments, different gambling by a different name, but also really interesting primitives for a proper financial system that we move to in the future. And I was so captivated by that, particularly around the way that they needed decentralized governance. So we can get into that whole time, but I like, how do these strangers on the internet coordinate around billions of dollars of value? And I started making these systems. Nobody knew how to do them, so I was just kind of early. And I've been working in that space for 5 years under an anonymous identity, and working for some really large projects kind of at the forefront of novel forms of human governance.
Amazing. And you've already mentioned a few things. I'm hoping I can do them justice. There's only so much we can do in the time we have. But I guess some people who are familiar with the podcast have maybe clicked on this episode and just listened to what you've just said and been a bit surprised.
Mm-hmm.
So before diving into any of this stuff, why, from your end, from your perspective, why is it what you've just said, anything like decentralized governance, like questions around communication, DeFi Summer 2020, like why is any of this relevant to the Spiritual Sexual Shamanic Podcast, Jamie?
Guys, check your podcast app. I think you clicked the wrong button somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is quite relevant. I mean, I'll take a different path to answer it, which is that I've just been a huge fan of, lover of, participant in the ISTA field for few years now, and gone to many ISTAs and assisted many ISTAs. And it's been a huge life-changing force for me, a hugely positive force. And so many of my dearest friends are now in that community. And ISTA asked me to help consult a bit, to think about power structures and governance and decision making, which has been a total delight and honor. And so that kind of, it's like, well, why is it interesting? And one of the things that's so fascinating is what ISTA is really dealing with, in my view, is, well, many things, but one of them is internal power. So how does an individual grow and develop and become whole and heal and align and turn on the power to be a force for good and for love and in bliss in the world? And that's this inner alchemy and magic that ISTA is so extraordinarily good at. My work is like as within, so without. I am working on power between individuals, power in groups. So it's kind of like two sides of the same coin, um, and it's very, very similar. So normally we look at the exoteric view of power structures, but there's also an esoteric view and a shamanic view, and how organisms or collectives can be seen as life, collective life, and how collective intelligence rises, and how the relationships within to the individuals is very similar to the way that we deal with trauma in the individual, or shame, or parts work, or anything like that. So there's a lot of ways to go with the kind of connections there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, could you illustrate that a little bit more, perhaps, or elaborate on what is similar between, or maybe even start by sort of talking a little bit more about this idea of internal power. Like,
Yeah,
what does that mean? Because yeah, like that resonates for me, having also been in the ISTA field for like quite a while now, and I have a sense, I have a felt sense, we say, of what you mean by internal power, but yeah, how do you see that, or how would you articulate that, and then maybe draw a bridge into maybe what many listeners would understand, having been involved in their own companies or businesses, their lines of work, of their family structures or whatever. What is the bridge between that internal power and how power moves between and amongst people?
yeah, it's a good question. Um, yeah, I can share from my experience that I gained power in my life through many things, through growth. I think maybe it's as simple as that. As you grow and you expand in your capacity to hold energies, more power can flow through you, and that process is one of resolving blockages, of healing wounds, confronting inner demons, letting go of petty attachments. All of those types of things are blocks to the flow of energy, and we are all of life is channeling this power. This and what is what I mean by power is the ability to change things. The ability to affect things, and particularly for good. I think maybe power can go in both directions, but we are in the service of something bigger, and as we grow, we can be more powerful in that, towards that end. And this is an individual journey, but it's also a collective journey. We an organization has power as well in the world. Like all we know, like nation states, corporations, collectives, families, tribes, any groups of people have their own kind of agency, which is the result of the way that it's the result of both each individual's agency and the way that those individuals are connected together to create the group's agency. And that group being can become more powerful in two ways. One way is each individual within it becomes more powerful. And the other way is that the relationships and the structures that support relationality and intelligence between the agent, the subagents, improves.
Like with some of these balls in the air from what we've introduced already, like I'm thinking about this more esoteric angle on things, and that makes a lot of sense, and I can understand that bridge. Internal power increases with growth, and then that works in organizations because you've got organizations of people who maybe grow in their own internal power, but that organization is like a similar body composed of these empowering individuals that has its own um, growing power. Um, how then? Okay, how does that link with the tech world? Very generally put, because yeah, and I'm putting that out there like just like a noob kind of regular person. You're obviously living in that, um, but like for people who may be more on my side of understanding, like very little, how does that kind of esoteric view or general, maybe even theoretical view of how power could work at the embodied level or the organizational level mesh with tech?
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, we're all these points in this extremely big, infinite, multidimensional, well, wild experience of life. And if we go way back, technology kind of makes more sense. It's like, monkeys together can coordinate to a certain extent. They create groups, uh, they take care of each other, they're able to support a certain level of group identity. And then the difference between a group of monkeys and a group of, let's say, prehistoric humans with language, more sophisticated language, you can think of that as a kind of technology, that capacity for communication in a richer, denser uh, way enables more orders of manifestation, of group capacity, of potential, in the group as there's a growth in that connective field between the beings.
Yeah,
And and then the more that develops, like, okay, so now you're just people together talking, there's some potential for power in that group. But now with digital technologies, with the ability to communicate across distance, with virtual reality, with AI, all of these things basically massively expand the communications bandwidth between minds and allow us to network and weave together with more fictions, more ideas, more life can flow.
yeah, yeah. So how do we organize that? Yeah, I think all of us would have an understanding or have dealt with this like rapid and massive expansion of capability, whether
Yeah.
just being able to do stuff, be more productive, so to um, communicate more effectively in a more direct way or specific way. I mean, but like, yeah, how do we organize that?
That's the question. And I think that's the process of the collective developing. So you can look at, esoterically, you can look at the different levels of life. This kind of Arthur Kessler has this term called holarchy, and that we are each both a part and a whole. I'm a whole being. I'm also a part of the earth, which is a whole being and has its own, many of us believe it has its own consciousness, its own life. And the bacteria in my gut and the cells in my body, they're parts and wholes of this being. And it may be that each of these cells has its own agency, and they're wired up in a way that creates this group field of me that has my own agency. And so how you connect them is everything. So you can take single cells and put them together in what's called a slime mold, which maybe some people have seen. It's a kind of mold. It's really interesting because it looks like an alien, but really it's single cellular. There's all these like, or maybe it's multicellular, but it's very, very simple. Like each cell is basically doing its own sensing and responding. There's not like a central nervous system or anything. It's just like a cellular kind of um, pudding, but it does these really interesting things. Like it'll move in interesting ways. It looks like life, but it's kind of limited. But then if you take all those cells and you wire them together like a fly brain, you know, that's maybe the same amount of cells, but the way that they're connected and the way that they're able to specialize completely changes the game in terms of information processing or life force capacity, whatever frame you want to look at it under, so that group of cells is able to be of much higher service to something. Or we can go back to what service is and say, but more power. It can do more.
Yeah, yeah. So, what's a good way for cells to organize?
Yeah, well, we're figuring it out, and there's a lot. That's a big question. That the We can again go back in history a little bit to look at it. So we've gone through this progression, and we're looking at the collective lens is the best lens to look at it here, right? So the cells are the humans. We've Yuval Harari talks about progressive fictions, and that fiction is one of the main differentiators between humans and other animals. And to say at a certain point we organized into tribes, and that had a certain potential, but the fiction couldn't get bigger than that group, because of technology limitations and geographical and environmental issues. humans could only scale their coordinating capacity to, a few hundreds of people. And then, but then it grew and they became bigger tribes and then became nation states, and millions of people were able to organize and coordinate, and they could do certain things. But then corporations are probably the, most advanced form, well, let's say most advanced legacy forms of organization on the planet. It can do even more. You can get, hundreds of thousands of people to make huge impact on the planet, for better or worse. But one of the main things that we're learning now in blockchain and decentralized governance is there's a huge step change possible between everything that came before and what's happening in the future. Yeah, we're at this major turning point in collective capacity right now, as we're moving from limitations of centralized trust to the possibilities of decentralized trust. And that's a bit of a mouthful and confusing to a lot of people. So can maybe ground it in some cases to understand a little bit better. Like,
Please.
yeah,
So we're talking about the limitations of what you're calling centralized
yeah,
trust versus the something of decentralized
the
trust.
possibilities of decentralized.
Possibilities of
Yeah,
decentralized trust.
because we're really at the beginning of decentralized trust. Decentralized trust has only been possible since Bitcoin, um, and it's something quite new. And many of us would argue that the only net new thing that crypto offers is actually decentralized trust. Um,
What is it? Decentralized trust.
so let's take Bitcoin as an example. So Bitcoin doesn't need a Federal Reserve Bank to manage its monetary policy. There's actually no central agency or actor that controls or manages Bitcoin's value. Bitcoin's value is market driven, and it's able to retain value because Bitcoin makes two main commitments. And these are unbreakable commitments cryptographically. There's theoretical attacks, let's say, and there's potential security issues, but by and large, these are about as firm a commitment as can be made on the planet today. One commitment is there'll only be 21 million Bitcoin. Another commitment is that you can't steal my Bitcoin. That's it, pretty much. So from those two commitments, this incredible financial system is born. That's the basis of, so you don't have to, those two commitments have decentralized trust. You can trust them with no centralized actor holding that trust. No human actor or agency can change those commitments on their own,
Hmm.
which is very powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's very simple. Like Ethereum and smart contract based blockchains enable computing with those same types of trust provisions. So you can create software application that nobody can shut down. But where it gets really interesting, I think the world hasn't really even seen the beginning of what's possible here. You can then create organizations that are trustless. And that's what I've been working on for the past 5 years. And to be honest, it doesn't work very well yet, but it's a long game, and it will.
Yeah. I would love to go in that direction for a minute.
Yeah.
Like, um, I think, and in I referenced the messages that we exchanged. You sent me a couple of videos about some of the projects that you've been working on. This was months ago now, and I guess I understood a lot of the videos, more or less, but then I got to this sort of point where I'm like, okay, yeah, how does this apply to companies or human organizations? How could one create projects that feel similar to what we're used to being involved in, but have this kind of trustless organization that you're talking about. How can that work?
It can work in a lot of different ways, and it can also fail in a lot of different ways. But
Mm.
the one of the challenges, so first of all, centralization is critical. So going back to the slime mold is totally decentralized. It can do some cool things, but it's not going to fix your motorcycle or something. You need the capacity for both centralized and decentralized systems. Where the decentralization piece really matters is it's the substrate that like supports all of the capacity to do centralized things. So the idea would be, let's think of it in a democratic system where in governance, by the way, happens in any organization. I'm governing myself. You and I are governing this podcast together. Any group has a kind of decision-making structure around governance in it. Now you want to create say you want to create a company, and out of a few hundred people, and you want this particular project to have each person to have some type of say in how it's constructed, rather than it be just me. Maybe I'm the initiator of this, but and I've started a lot of companies in the past, and I've often faced this question of like, how do I know what's right for this whole group to do? Like, I have the best. I might even have the best context. I might be the smartest one. I might have all of the advantages, and still I'm only one person. In a group of 200, there's all these other viewpoints that are intelligence that are not getting into the system. And if it's just me making decisions, I'm a huge bottleneck, right? So even if I'm a benevolent dictator, there's only so much I can do. So how can you increase that capacity? And it's this game of like super intelligence. And so we do have super intelligence on the planet right now, and it's basically a group of 7 high trust, high skilled people. Um, that's the only thing that's really smarter than any individual human. But as you scale up, you go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 people. That's about the max we can do. After that, intelligence starts to really drop off, and there's studies that support this. Um, but so how do we push that number? How do we have a really intelligent few hundred people? Normally, large groups are extremely unintelligent. It's mob mentality. We do horrible things in large groups. How can we scale that collective intelligence? And there's a lot of possibilities, but what decentralized trust allows for is more bandwidth. You can give ownership, you can give property rights, decision making rights to a larger group, and then empower them to be of service to the whole. And there's a lot of nuance here again, but the first thing that does is it activates people. And you can see that in DAOs, and you can see that in crypto now. You can also see that in things like the co-op movement, or you can see that in collective living. You can see that in teal organizations pre-blockchain that are working in more integral ways. It activates people. It gives people more power, more power to affect the organization. But then, as you scale, it starts to get harder to do that more. So you need a really nice way to think about this is like, what is the foundation of the intelligence that's arising? And one of my favorite thinkers in crypto, Sri Ram Kanan, has this 4 layers of coordination. He talks about at the bottom layer is called self-enforcing. The layer up from there is the majority. This is like democratic vote. Above that is like the expert or plutocratic or technocratic layer, and then at the top is the authoritarian layer. And you can think of the United States as an example here. So you've got the executive branch at the top, the president. Then you've got Congress at the expert level, and the various NGOs and other groups. And then you've got the voters at the majoritarian level. And underneath them, you have the Constitution. And so the Constitution is the foundation. How much you can trust the Constitution means that all this stuff up here can be stronger and more capable. So why do some countries outperform others? One argument is that the trust assumptions you can make about their base levels of law and jurisprudence are just less structurally sound as others. So when you're working in a system of strong property rights and jurisprudence and deliberation, all these things, and have a track record of that you can predict and trust, you can invest your resources into that substrate with more predictability about what's going to happen, and that it becomes a magnet for investment for life force. Now but the Constitution is actually not so strong a foundation. It's constantly being debated. It's up for interpretation. But an immutable smart contract on an unbreakable blockchain, that's a totally different level of concreteness. So the types of organizations that can be built on top of that is profound. And just I've gone a lot. I just want to come back and cap it off. So like, how do organizations become different? Why is decentralized organization better? When you have your entire like rule set for your organization in that type of blockchain substrate with functional methods of decentralized governance, each individual can own their own decision-making authority, and they can decide to grant it to a representative to act on their behalf, but then pull it back if they want to vote on their own. You can do all these forms of liquid democracy and futurarchy and markets and all these different decision-making systems that really aren't possible in previous ways, that allow for centralized expert decision-making, but in transparent, auditable, secure, accountable structures.
Yeah. How do we overcome like the complexity problem? Like, it's yeah, it seems like just access to these amazing sounding new ways of thinking and being together, doing business, etc. Access to this requires like a level of understanding, maybe education, even, unfortunately, capital, all of these things. How do we deal with that?
Well, I think that there's two pieces to this. The first one is that these systems are very, very new, and we shouldn't expect that everyone will be able to deal with them, interact with them, or should yet. New social change emerges at the frontiers, and there's only a few people that start to harness those patterns, those energies, and then it spreads through more of us. We're still at that kind of very early stage. These technologies barely work for the most sophisticated users, so they're not ready for the prime time. I mean, there's places that we can test them, and we are, and people are, but you know, it's but it's speeding up. I think some of the tech will be ready for larger scale use pretty soon in terms of governance
Mm,
deliberation processes. That's one piece, but the other piece is that um, there's a certain amount of literacy that we each need in navigating the collective. So we would call this civics. We need to understand how legislation is passed, and we need to have basic financial understanding about balancing your checkbook or managing a portfolio. Any of these things, these are all useful things to learn. These have all upgraded pretty soon, and they're all going to start upgrading even more. So we're going to have to start learning the basics and be teaching our kids the basics of decentralized finance, of blockchain based investments, of decentralized governance. Just part of the development.
yeah, yeah. I feel like I want to kind of bring it back at this point to ISTA.
Mm.
Um, like we don't need to get into the specifics so much, but like with this, just what we've said about yeah, decentralized governance and this being on the like the emerging threshold of
Yeah.
how things could work to our benefit as a civilization in the future. Like, why is from your involvement, why has ISTA been exploring this? And maybe again to reiterate, like, why is it relevant to an organization like ISTA? Where's the juice in it? Yeah.
Well, there's so much juice in it. I first I'll tell a bit of a story. I remember I was working on this big DAO project like 5 years ago, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, and I had this realization. I was creating.
But and sorry, Jamie,
Yeah,
a DAO would usually be involved in what kind of enterprise or like what purpose would a DAO have usually up until this point?
yeah. So the classic shape of a big DAO is it's a governance structure that controls a blockchain protocol. The blockchain protocol
Yeah,
is a piece of software, right? But
yeah,
it's a software running on blockchain, so it's immutable in many cases, or it might be upgradable, but it has very, very strict security um, design architectures and things like that. And And
Yeah.
so but a good example is Uniswap. Uniswap is a decentralized exchange. So you can go on a Uniswap and you can trade one crypto token for another crypto token, just like you would go to your portfolio or whatever, Schwab or whatever you're using to trade a stock. Um, so, but Uniswap's a beautiful protocol. It is immutable, and it just has like few decisions that can be made in that system. And so, like at the kind of most simplistic view, there's only two things you can do in Uniswap. They have a treasury of like billions of dollars of Uniswap tokens, so you can spend that money, or you can push this one button that switches where the fees go from like liquidity providers to token holders. That's all the governance surface of Uniswap. And so there's a DAO, a decentralized organization. Anybody that owns the Uni token can make proposals to do either spend money or push that button. And then they vote on those proposals. So that's a simple view of what a DAO does.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. Okay. Sorry, you were saying?
Yeah. And then, by the way, DAOs can get more complicated and, can manage many, many more types of surfaces and things like that. And they work less well in those cases. But so I was saying I was working on DAO system, a new governance design for this large multi-billion-dollar decentralized finance project. And what I realized was that like all these people are coming together from all over the world and all these different worldviews to make decisions together in the best interest of this collective project. Like everybody that's buying this token wants it to increase in value, and they're using that token to like vote on proposals to change the way that this software project is going to work that may impact the value of that token. But people come together from so many different places. Like one person might be a 13-year-old in like a war-torn country, Another person might be like a 60-year-old meditation guru. People speak different languages. They're at different places developmentally in their lives. And there's many, many different worlds here. Like if people from these very different places come together, they're going to see things very differently. And I saw that happening over and over again. It's like these tools that I was making would work for some, not work for others. And it was really hard to find the right coordination mechanism for all the different people. And I thought at that time, what I really need to do is I need to work with a group of extremely developed people that are all kind of generally in the same worldview and create a mechanism for them first, because you really want the most developed people in a society to, be at the highest levels of deliberation within that society. Not exclusively, but they have a key role, just like the elders did in any tribe. Like they're the most developed. Like we go to them for our biggest, toughest questions, right? You need that too. And I thought, I would just love to do this for ISTA, because ISTA has this incredibly powerful group of very developed, very sensitive, thoughtful people that care so much about making the right decisions, about helping people, of being a good force. And they're bold and, and fiery, and they're willing to take risks and do things that maybe others will be confused by or receive conflict, and like step into the fray and really stand up for something. So uh, when ISTA asked me to help with these things, is such an exciting, perfect thing. And so now, why would ISTA want to work on decision making? Why the fuck wouldn't they? Because it's about being better at making decisions. It's about like activating the field with more power, more capacity. Like any organization, not just ISTA, has people that are related to it, that they're working in, people buying the services, people providing the services, people talking about it. How do you create an organization that's really in service of all those groups, that's listening to all those groups, that's able to make decisions? Like that's hard. And the centralized systems that we have right now are pretty limited in how they're able to really do that and work with the field, especially if you want to empower that field. So it makes total sense that ISTA would look to the latest technologies in power, in ISTA doesn't want to like wield power over a group, and like that's the last thing ISTA wants to do. It wants to create growth and change and transformation. And so if there's a structure that ISTA can give power into, they can help the whole field grow, then there's, yeah, no resistance.
Yeah, totally. That's so nicely explained. And some of the things I'm thinking as you're speaking are some of the ways, in my experience, ISTA has tried to articulate its organization, how is some of the ways it's tried to articulate and conceptualize or structure, yeah, how power moves, how, yeah, like people are positioned. What is the org chart of ISTA? It's always been a bit of a, people have roles and there's very few. There's facilitators and there's organizers. That's basically it.
Well, and council,
And then there are some,
yeah,
again,
council also, yeah,
yeah, and then within the
yeah,
facilitators, there's like portfolios, and some of those are related to seniority, um, and like capability. So there's the lead facilitators, and they're a small group. They're the most experienced ones. The council has formed in the last quite recently,
yeah,
to take over, so take more of a like synoptic view of what's going on. But that used to be a governance circle of three, and the the thing about the governance circle that was popping up to me that seemed relevant to what you're saying was the idea, I think, at some point was that those three governance they would cycle through every 18 months would be metaphorically but also energetically and shamanically peering into the void, into the mystery, and as these elders in the community, in the organization, they would have maybe a more enhanced sensitive capacity to interpret the mystery as it came through them, um, and be able to communicate something of what they were paying attention to other people in the organism. So, and it's making me think of other sort of esoteric or mystical structures for organizing around, um, for organizing in such a way doesn't doesn't prioritize individual. I don't know how to say. I don't want to say egoic individuality or something like that. It's a bit too buzzy, but like I feel like a lot of communities, not just ISTA, but ISTA, like in the way that you're explaining it, yes, um, have tried to solve these problems of like how to organize without it sort of getting sticky,
yeah,
you know.
yeah.
And it seems like is this the new sort of a new enhancement or development in how to do this?
It's not just ISTA. It's not just spiritual organizations. It's like all
Right.
organizations get into this stickiness, and
Yeah.
but if we keep it to spiritual, like a lot of spiritual organizations, as they grow in popularity, as more money comes in, as more people come in, they hit growing pains. And
Yeah.
there's this kind of blind spot that we all have. We it's called. I've been thinking about this through the lens of Dunning Kruger. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's basically some studies that each people can tend to overestimate their knowledge in certain areas, and then sometimes there's like this correlation between overconfidence and underinformed.
Don't know anything about it.
Yeah,
I
you can
just
see,
I just run a podcast where I have to
yeah.
sound like that. But
So like, I think that this is basically like a just a fundamental nature of reality. Actually, is that we all have this, and we all at times think we know more than we do, and a lot of the time we look at organizational failures and we blame individuals because we're familiar with the personal story, but not so many of us are familiar with actually what it takes to operate a multi-billion-dollar company with thousands of employees, right? And so we kind of we personalize that, and we think, oh, it's this asshole CEO, what a douchebag, what a bully. Like, they're just trying, if they were just good people, then somehow this company would work well. But that's not really the case. Like, there are bullies and assholes and terrible CEOs too. I'm not saying there aren't, but a bigger part of it is the actual structural developmental level we are as a species, technologically, socially, spiritually, physically, all like there's a certain place that we've gotten to, and that creates inadequacies in the Nash equilibria of these various structures, like how multi-agent systems come together to deliberate and share resources and affect change is limited by structural developmental blockages. And no matter how amazing an individual you put at the top of that company or that structure, it's not going to succeed. It's not a, it's it can only do so much, so we have to take a look at the whole kind of the four quadrants in integral theory. We have to look at all of the ways that things are arising, and any but really, like previously it was so fascinating. ISTA had the governance group of three staring into the dark, channeling the divine to make decisions on behalf of the whole in a very shamanic and beautiful way that, there's inspired by many different wisdom traditions and shamanic peoples and pagan traditions. And that worked really well. It brought ISTA helped a fucking lot of people, and it grew, and there's more money, more people, more interest. It goes through growing pains. Even those three people, the best people in the world, they have limited capacity. No matter how good they are at channeling the dark, it's limited. Then when there's all these other people in the field that also have viewpoints, perspectives, how do you wire that in? Like there's this calculus between individual development, structural development that needs to be taken account. And there's always growing pains in any collective, just like an individual. It's fractal, it's holarchic, it's mystical. Like you go through these levels of development with fulcrums and challenges and crises and adventure and resolution and further growth. And so ISTA is going through a growth period, and it's learning it's working on figuring out in this very vulnerable and open way how to rewire the agents that give it rise, including all of the students, including all of the observers. Like, how do we activate them? One of the questions I always ask, I know I'm rambling a bit. One of the questions I always ask is let's look at the whole organization, it's like everybody that's ever heard the word ISTA, we could say, that's the whole field. And like, what is the best job? How much power can we give to everybody in that field? And what's the best job? And what's the tools that everybody needs to make that entire system grow to its maximum capacity? And I don't mean just to get bigger like a cancer. I mean, spiritual growth,
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few things in there, and the one that's just arrived for me is this, like, wanting to come back to what you said, like your motivation for working with ISTA, like you're working on something else, and there's this problem of, which seems like a substantial one, of like, okay, everyone who wants to be involved in this DAO is like coming from radically different perspectives, but an organization like ISTA, yes, highly developed individuals, some might say totally not developed at all, like total animals, like,
different
but,
viewpoints,
but, but they say again.
different strokes for different folks. Some people are
Exactly. Yeah. But you said something like, it was, ISTA was a good sort of place to develop this kind of concept of the DAO that you were working on, because there was like a similarity between the individuals.
yeah,
I feel like I just want to poke at that because, like, there's something in me that wants to say I wouldn't want to be reliant on having, to have like pre-established, deep familiarity between individuals for something like this to work. Like, do you get what I'm saying? Like, how do we pair ourselves away from that requirement towards something that can really, like,
yeah.
a system or a style of organization that can really deal with radical difference?
Well, I think you're right in that we need something that's more anti-fragile than a system that requires a homogenous group of worldviews. Absolutely. And like I've been at the front lines of decentralized governance since there really was such a thing, and it doesn't work very well, is the truth. Like it works shockingly well from one perspective, and from another perspective, it's really not where it needs to be. And
Just decentralized governance in general. You're
it
right.
doesn't really work.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unsolved challenges, a lot of unsolved problems.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
I'm
Right.
like, my mission, my purpose is to fucking solve these challenges, and like
Mm.
find out how to move the needle on this so that we can scale our intelligence and and survive these crises that the world is going through,
Yeah.
and I thought, and I still think that one of the ways that I can maybe crack some of these problems is by focusing on a smaller group of people that are really powerful already, right? So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
people that aren't afraid of power. And one of the challenges that happens that I've seen in
Mm.
a lot of DAOs is that there's a lot of fear of power. There's a lot of trust issues. There's a lot of this kind of Dunning-Kruger critique, like you guys are doing things wrong. And I think at ISTA, and now so I'll make a case that I think the ISTA core field is much more developed than most other groups I've ever encountered. And this is let's say what's the word, challenging, a controversial view. There's a lot of people believe that we're all equal, and I would say yes, we are equal as souls, right? But we're not equal in terms of our expression in this body, in this life, in various ways. Like a PhD quantum physicist knows more about physics than a 5-year-old. There are differences and there's hierarchies. It's natural, right? And we can, even though we're not perfect, we can look and find our own developmental level. There is a ladder, and we're all working on this ladder, and some of that ladder is fairly well described. And I would make a bet that if you take all the people within ISTA and you average their developmental level, it's going to be higher than a lot of other groups. And this makes people upset. Higher, lower. Yeah, there is higher and lower, and it's okay. There's always something higher than us too, like so. What was exciting to me about that is that I could create a governance system that could maybe that um, I just basically think it would be easier for me to create a governance system for a group like that than a group that includes multiple different subgroups. And of course, we're
Mm.
abstracting and generalizing it. There's a lot of variation within ISTA too. It's not all the same worldview at all. There's a lot of different
Yeah.
perspectives, you know.
Totally. Yeah.
But generally, developmentally, people are pretty highly developed.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. So interesting. Um, I wonder, we haven't got heaps of time left, and I've got this word rattling around my head, responsibility.
Mm.
Like power and responsibility. I feel like that's ingrained in me as kind of like two words that should go together, And but then when we're bringing this idea of like trustless systems, uh, what happens to responsibility when we have these highly complex and powerful trustless, mechanisms that can they seem like they relieve us of responsibility. Is there some sort of esoteric or like meta structural approach uh, that
Yeah,
you take on that?
there is. Well, I think trustless systems allow us to trust each other even more, actually. So it's like when you take away the uncertainty in a system and you make it very clear, like in an RBDSM conversation, it's like you can specify, like what your desire is, what your boundaries are. You clarify the kind of agreement field between two people, and then you can trust each other much more. You can open up much more.
Right. And for those who don't know, this is a conversation. It's an acronym for a conversation that we teach in the ISTA experience. Like if you're interested in someone, or like, yeah, you can have it with anyone, whether you're romantically or erotically interested with them or not. One of the things we teach as an option is you can enter into this conversation and you go through like a set number of things like what are my desires for this interaction, what are my boundaries for this interaction, and a bunch of other things, so you kind of get on the same page. That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, trustless infrastructure allows for highly trusted relationships, and responsibility is, oh, it's such a beautiful gift that we have to be able to take responsibility, but like to take it cleanly. Another thing we learn in ESTA is, the victim triangle, and the savior, and like taking responsible for people when, that's actually harmful to them, and they don't need it. It makes them a victim and it believes their victim story, right? We don't want to do that either. I think when I'm designing the system, I think a lot about sovereignty and synergy, and So the responsibilities are huge, and the more sovereignty that we can give people within a field, then the more synergy we also need. And synergy is about accountability, about you know actively making commitments and standing by those commitments and being accountable for them and to each other. And decentralized governance has space for that to a very high degree. A lot of space for that.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. Well, hey Jamie, it's so good to talk to you. Like, I feel like we're just sort of clearing the way for what's to come. But like, is there any last words or things that you feel are bubbling that maybe haven't been touched on or maybe haven't landed that you'd want to leave people with before we wrap up the episode?
What's coming up is actually like a lot of optimism that I want to share. I think it can be very easy to get um, overwhelmed and fearful about the very major global political changes that are happening on the planet. And there's a lot of really scary things that we can look at, and there's a lot of abuses, and there's a lot of harm. Um, and there's also my optimism is that there's also a lot of development, and it's often hard to see, but I do see a lot of it. And I think we're going through a civilizational change here, and it's going to be full of crisis and death and growth. And I'm really optimistic because I do see, being so close to so many of these things at the very, very frontier of what's possible, how incredible they're going to be.
Mm.
And there there's so much possible soon, and I think we're actually headed in a pretty good trajectory. So yeah,
That's a beautiful place to leave it.
yeah.
Right? If people want to follow up with some of the things you've been talking about, is there some way that they can tune into your work in the world, or
Not really,
um,
because I work under a pseudonym, and but I don't know if you're motivated. Reach out to me. I'll share my pseudonym with you.
Sure, sure, amazing. Well, thanks so much, Jamie. Look forward to speaking to you again in the future, and yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks, Simon.